Chapter 81 Grand Royal Games 6. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, roasting meats from the vendor stalls, and the sharp, nervous sweat of the competitors. In the royal box, situated perfectly at the midfield line, Eddard Stark sat in quiet observation. To his left, Queen Cersei wore a gown of rich crimson, her face a mask of bored contempt, a scented handkerchief held delicately to her nose. To her side sat Lord Tywin Lannister, exuding a cold, unyielding authority, his green eyes calculating the odds and the politics playing out on the mud below. The great round had whittled the kingdoms down. The pretenders had been eliminated. Now only the true titans of the realm remained to fight for the king's ransom. The master of the games, a herald with lungs like a blacksmith's bellows, stepped onto the raised wooden platform at the edge of the pitch. He raised a massive mammoth horn to his lips and blew a long, resounding blast that silenced the deafening roar of the crowd. "Lords and ladies of the realm," the herald boomed, "the hour of the culling has passed. The chaff has blown away in the wind. We stand now at the pinnacle of the Grand Royal Games." The small folk stamped their feet on the wooden bleachers, setting up a rhythmic thunder that shook the foundations of the arena. "For the ultimate trial of the shield wall," the herald continued, waving a heavy yellow flag. "Two forces remain unbroken. From the freezing winds of the north, the winter wolves." A massive cheer erupted from the northern contingents and those small folk who favored the stoic discipline of the Starks. From the northern tunnel, 15 men clad in dark gray, padded boiled leather marched out onto the mud. They were led by Benjen Stark and Willem, the captain of the Wolf Guard. They moved with absolute, silent precision. "And to face them," the herald roared, taking a deep breath, "the undefeated champions of the heavy earth, led by the demon of the trident himself, the stags of the Crownlands." The arena exploded. King Robert Baratheon emerged from the southern tunnel, and the noise of the crowd transcended cheering. It became a physical force. He wore thick, mud-stained leather padding, his massive arms bare to the biting wind. He was grinning like a madman, flanked by the largest, most fearsome knights of the Crownlands and the Stormlands, all stripped of their steel and ready for the dirt. Thuras of Myr walked beside him, holding a wineskin, waving to the roaring small folk. Robert threw his massive arms wide, basking in the adoration of his city. The two teams met at the center chalk line. The mud was deep, slick, and unforgiving. The 15 men of the Wolf Guard looked small compared to the towering behemoths Robert had assembled. But Benjen Stark did not look intimidated. He looked focused. "You did well to make it this far, little wolf," Robert taunted across the mere inches separating their faces. "But the stag lowers his horns today." "The mud doesn't care about horns, your grace," Benjen replied evenly, his voice steady. "It only cares about roots." The master of the games raised the red flag. He looked down the lines, ensuring the men had locked their arms tightly over each other's shoulders. The flag dropped. "Oonk! With me!" Robert bellowed. The Crownlands line surged forward. The impact was sickeningly heavy. The sound of 30 bodies colliding, leather slapping against leather, air rushing forcefully from lungs, echoed sharply across the silent arena. Robert Baratheon hit the absolute center of the northern line like a falling siege ram. Benjen Stark took the brunt of the king's terrifying charge. The breath was violently shoved from his chest. The entire northern line bowed inward, their boots sliding backward a full 2 paces in the slick clay. The crowd screamed, anticipating a swift, brutal rout. "Hold the center. Drop!" Benjen roared, his voice strained. The Wolf Guard executed the maneuver that had broken every other team. They did not try to match the king's raw power. They yielded a fraction, absorbing the forward kinetic energy, and dropped their hips dangerously low. They dug their heavy heels deep into the underlying bedrock beneath the mud. The backward slide halted abruptly. The match instantly transformed from a dynamic charge into a suffocating, agonizing grind. It was a battle of opposing elements. Robert Baratheon fought with absolute explosive fire. He pulled, he heaved. He drove his massive legs like driving pistons, roaring continuously to keep the morale of his men burning white-hot. Benjen and the Wolf Guard fought with ice. They fell into the synchronized breathing Ned had drilled into them. They closed their eyes to the pain in their shoulders and the burning in their thighs. They became the glacier, immovable, enduring, outlasting the storm. For 10 excruciating minutes, the lines did not move. The pristine pitch was churned into a deep, sucking trench of brown sludge. Steam rose in thick, billowing clouds from the locked bodies of the men, hanging over them like a shroud. Faces turned a bruised, deep purple from the sheer physical strain. "They cannot break him," Tywin Lannister murmured in the royal box. His eyes narrowed as he watched the king strain against the northern center. "The Stark men are too low. They have stolen the king's leverage." Ned watched intently. His men were executing the strategy flawlessly. But he also knew Robert. Robert Baratheon was not a man who accepted a stalemate. Down in the mud, Robert felt the burning in his massive chest. He felt the unyielding, infuriatingly calm resistance of the boys locked against him. He realized that brute, forward force was simply driving the Northmen deeper into the earth like iron nails. He needed to uproot them. "Thuras," Robert grunted through gritted teeth. "Balon," he called to the massive men flanking him. "Stop pushing forward," Robert commanded, his voice a harsh, guttural rasp heard only by his immediate line. "When I shout, we push up." The Crownlands men tightened their grips. Robert waited for the exact right moment. He waited until he felt the rhythm of the northern lines breathing, the slow, steady exhale as they braced. "Ours is the fury," Robert screamed, a primal sound torn from the very depths of his soul. The king did not drive his legs backward. He dropped his massive knees into the freezing mud and violently thrust his entire body upward, launching his thick shoulders directly up under Benjen Stark's chest. The entire Crownlands line mimicked the motion perfectly. The shift in the angle of force was catastrophic for the north. The Wolfguard had anchored themselves against a forward assault. The sudden, immense, upward heave caught them entirely off guard. Benjen felt his boots physically lift a fraction of an inch out of the deep clay. Denied their connection to the earth, the northern leverage vanished completely. "Drive!" Robert roared, his face a mask of mud and absolute, terrifying joy. With their footing compromised, the Wolfguard could not absorb the renewed forward rush. The center of the line shattered backward. "Hold!" Benjen shouted, desperately trying to re-anchor his boots, but it was too late. The Crownlands line surged forward like a breaking dam. They trampled through the deep ruts, shoving the off-balance Northmen relentlessly backward. They covered 5 paces in a matter of seconds, then 10. The crowd went into an absolute frenzy, the noise deafening. With one final, synchronized, roaring heave, Robert Baratheon drove the entire remaining mass of the Wolfguard violently backward across the white chalk defeat line. The horn blew 3 sharp blasts. The lock broke. Men from both sides collapsed into the freezing sludge, gasping for air, their chests heaving, their muscles spasming uncontrollably. Benjen Stark dropped to his knees, wiping thick mud from his eyes, utterly exhausted. King Robert Baratheon did not fall. He stood in the center of the ruined pitch, his chest rising and falling in massive gulps. He was coated entirely in foul-smelling brown clay, but his eyes were blazing with the pure, unadulterated high of absolute victory. "The stag!" A Crownlands knight roared from the mud. His men surged to their feet, ignoring their own exhaustion. They surrounded the king. With a synchronized heave, they hoisted Robert Baratheon onto their shoulders. The entire arena exploded into a single, unified chant. "Robert! Robert! Robert!" Robert threw his muddy arms high into the air, laughing triumphantly as he was carried across the field. He looked up at the royal box and pointed a massive, mud-caked finger directly at Ned Stark, a gesture of profound brotherhood and victorious boasting. Ned could not help it. He stood up from his chair, a genuine, wide smile breaking across his face, and began to applaud his best friend. Beside him, Queen Cersei turned away in absolute revulsion, unable to bear the sight of her husband being celebrated like a muddy barbarian. Tywin Lannister simply stared, his expression unreadable, calculating the immense political capital the king had just won with the common people. The shield wall belonged to the crown. An hour of respite was called to allow the combatants to recover and the pitch to be smoothed over. The sun passed its zenith, casting long, dramatic shadows across the clay. In the northern pavilion beneath the stands, the mood was bruised but proud. Ned walked among the exhausted men of the Wolfguard. They were drinking heavily watered wine and having their sore shoulders rubbed down with pungent liniments. "You fought flawlessly," Ned told Willem, tossing the captain a clean towel. He changed the angle of the attack. "It was a brilliant maneuver. There is no shame in falling to the demon of the trident." We had him, Ned, Benjen groaned, holding an ice pack to his neck. If we had just widened the stance. You learn, Ned said simply, squeezing his brother's shoulder. But the day is not over. We have the charge. And the Westerlands team has been resting all morning. Across the complex, in a tent draped with crimson silk, Tyrion Lannister was holding court. His lions sat on heavy wooden benches, looking like polished, highly disciplined statues. They had not played in the morning matches, and their boiled leather was pristine. Tyrion paced before them, tapping his small riding crop against his palm. The Northmen are fast, Tyrion lectured, his mismatched eyes sweeping over his massive men. They rely on chaotic movement. They will try to draw you out of position with blind lateral tosses. They want you to chase the leather egg until your heavy legs give out. He pointed his crop directly at Lyle the ox and Dake. You do not chase, Tyrion commanded softly. You do not break formation. We will utilize the moving fortress. When we possess the egg, you form a perfect box around the carrier. You walk. You do not run. You grind them into the clay. If they try to tackle you, you let them break themselves against your superior mass. We are the anvil, and we will slowly, methodically crush them. We will crush the fast men, Lord Tyrion, Dake repeated earnestly. See that you do, Tyrion smiled thinly. My father is watching. Try not to embarrass us both. The horns blew, summoning the final contenders to the pitch. The mud had dried slightly in the afternoon wind, becoming a sticky, viscous paste that threatened to pull a man's boots right off his feet. The two white scoring posts stood proudly at opposite ends of the vast field. The Lions of the West marched out first. They were terrifying. 15 men of immense, uniform size, moving with a disciplined, heavy step that spoke of Tyrion's relentless drilling. The Winter Wolves followed. They looked smaller, leaner, their dark gray leather already stained from the morning's defeat. But their eyes were sharp, their breathing calm. The master of the games walked to the center line. He held the heavy, sand-filled leather egg. He looked at Benjen Stark, then at Dake, the massive captain of the Westerlands team. He placed the egg in the mud. He raised the red flag. For the king's ransom, the herald screamed. The flag dropped. The match erupted into instant, calculated violence. The Lions won the initial scramble for the ball. Dake scooped the heavy leather egg from the mud and immediately tucked it tightly against his thick chest. Fortress! Tyrion screamed from his mounting block on the sideline. The Lions executed the maneuver flawlessly. 6 massive men formed a tight, interlocking ring around Dake. They did not sprint toward the northern post. They locked their arms and began a slow, inexorable march down the field. It was a brilliant counter to northern speed. Benjen and the Wolfguard circled the moving box of meat, probing for weaknesses, but the Lannister formation was airtight. When Willem attempted to dive at the legs of an outer defender to trip the formation, another lion simply stepped over him, kicking him brutally in the ribs and maintaining the wall. The fortress ground its way across the field. 10 paces. 20. They are too heavy to stop like this, Willem shouted, scrambling back to his feet, clutching his side. The lions reached the white post. Dake, protected by the impenetrable wall of his teammates, simply reached out and tapped the leather egg against the wood. Mark T.O. the Westerlands, the herald called. In the royal box, Tywin Lannister allowed a minuscule, satisfied nod. Tyrion's strategy was brutally effective. The game reset. The North took possession. Patience, Benjen told his men in the huddle. They are heavy. Make them turn. Make them run. When the horn blew, Benjen took the ball. He didn't charge the Lannister line. He sprinted dead sideways, running parallel to the chalk line. The massive lions, conditioned to march forward, were forced to break their tight formation and pivot to pursue the swift northern lord. As Dake closed in to crush him against the boundary, Benjen executed a flawless, blind lateral toss over his shoulder. The ball sailed backward, landing perfectly in the hands of a trailing Wolfguard. The lions, carrying immense weight in the wrong direction, slipped and stumbled in the clinging clay as they tried to reverse course. The Northmen capitalized. They moved the ball with dizzying speed, utilizing short, sharp passes that pulled the heavier Westermen entirely out of position. Within moments, the Wolfguard had bypassed the exhausted defense, scoring a clean mark against the opposing post. The score was tied. The match devolved into an agonizing, strategic war of attrition. Tyrion's moving fortress was nearly impossible to stop, resulting in another grinding score for the West. But the sheer weight of the maneuver in the thick mud was draining the stamina of his giants. Benjen countered with the shadow hunt, utilizing lateral passing and misdirection to run the heavier men ragged, scoring again to equalize. The shadows of the grandstands began to stretch long across the pitch. The final minutes of the match were approaching. The men on the field were barely recognizable, covered entirely in thick brown clay, gasping for air, their lungs burning in the cold wind. "Next mark takes the prize," the herald screamed over the roaring crowd. The Westerlands had possession. They were 30 paces from the northern post. "Form the wall," Tyrion shrieked from the sideline, his voice cracking with anxiety. He could see Dake's legs trembling. The giants were running on empty. "Grind them down." The lions formed their protective box around Dake one last time. They began their slow march. Benjen wiped the sludge from his eyes. He looked at the moving fortress. He knew they couldn't break it conventionally. "Willem," Benjen gasped. "The legs. We take the foundation." The Wolfguard didn't circle this time. They formed a tight wedge of their own and charged directly at the front of the Lannister box. But a split second before impact, the Northmen dropped. They threw their bodies into the freezing mud, diving not for the men's chests, but directly at their churning boots. The impact was a chaotic, bone-jarring tangle of limbs. The front line of the Lannister fortress tripped over the bodies of the Northmen. The perfect formation shattered as massive men lost their footing in the slick clay and tumbled forward in a massive pileup. Dake, suddenly exposed and stumbling over his own fallen comrades, tried to leap over the pile. Willem surged up from the mud like a striking viper. He didn't tackle the giant. He drove his fist upward, punching directly into the crook of Dake's arm, jarring the nerve. Dake grunted in pain. The heavy leather egg popped loose from his grip, spinning freely into the air. "The egg!" Tyrion screamed in absolute panic. It was a mad scramble. Bodies dove into the mud, while the ox managed to get a massive, meaty hand on the leather, dragging it into his chest. But before he could secure it, Benjen Stark slammed a knee into Lyle's shoulder, ripping the ball free. Benjen rolled, coming up onto his feet near the western boundary line. He had the ball, but he was trapped. 3 massive Westerland defenders, including a furious Dake, had recovered and were bearing down on him, cutting off any angle to the scoring post. The sideline was at his back. He had nowhere to run. "Crush him," Tywin Lannister hissed under his breath in the royal box, his composure finally breaking. Benjen saw the giants closing in. He saw the trap. He didn't panic. He fell back on the relentless drills of the courtyard. He saw the layout of the field not as it was, but as it could be. He looked entirely across the vast width of the pitch. Willem had untangled himself from the pile and was sprinting down the completely unguarded far sideline, desperate to offer an option. Dake lunged, his massive arms spreading wide to tackle Benjen into the wooden fence. At the absolute last fraction of a second, Benjen planted his back foot. He gripped the heavy leather laces of the egg. With a ferocious primal grunt that drew upon every remaining ounce of his strength, he hurled the ball. He didn't toss it laterally. He launched it in a massive, soaring arc completely across the width of the muddy field. The crowd fell dead silent, tens of thousands of eyes tracking the impossible flight of the heavy leather ball as it sailed high over the heads of the chaotic scrum in the center. Tyrion Lannister's jaw dropped. "No!" Willem didn't break his stride. He kept his eyes on the spinning leather, adjusting his speed to the descent. The ball dropped flawlessly into Willem's outstretched hands. The entire Westerland's defense was hopelessly stranded on the opposite side of the field. Willem had an open, uncontested path. He sprinted the final 15 paces, his boots slapping the mud. He didn't slow down. He dove headfirst, sliding through the slick clay, and slammed the leather egg triumphantly against the base of the white wooden post. Thwack! The herald practically blew out his own lungs, sounding the final, definitive blasts of the mammoth horn. Victory to the Winter Wolves! The arena erupted into absolute, unbridled madness. The small folk threw their hats into the air, screaming themselves hoarse. Down in the mud, Benjen Stark lay flat on his back, staring up at the gray sky, a wide, exhausted grin splitting his face. He felt the heavy boots of Dake stop just inches from his head. The massive Westerman looked down at him, completely bewildered by the impossible pass. On the sideline, Tyrion Lannister slowly lowered his riding crop. He stared at the far post, then across the field to Benjen. He had lost. He had calculated every push of weight and mass, and the North had simply rewritten the limits of the game. Tyrion sighed, a wry, respectful smile touching his lips. He offered a deep, theatrical bow toward the muddy Stark. In the royal box, the contrast was absolute. King Robert Baratheon was roaring with laughter, slamming his hands on the wooden rail, thoroughly entertained by the spectacular finish. "Brilliant!" Robert bellowed, turning to the lords in the box. "A desperate trick, but brilliant. The wolves have stolen the swift prize." Tywin Lannister sat perfectly still. His face was carved from granite, his eyes cold and hard. He had watched his golden vanguard outplayed by speed and a desperate strike. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Ned Stark stood up. He did not cheer loudly, but his chest swelled with a profound, deep pride. He looked down at his brother and his captain, being hauled to their feet by their jubilant, mud-soaked team. Robert turned to his hand, his face flushed with the ultimate high of the day's events. "Jon, bring out the gold, and fetch the cups." Ned raised an eyebrow as Robert clapped him heavily on the shoulder. "Since I saw those magnificent trophies you presented at Sea Dragon Point for your brother's wedding, I had this idea in my mind." Robert grinned broadly. "I could not let the North outshine the crown. I had the royal smiths working for a moon's turn to forge prizes worthy of this mud." At a signal from the hand, heavily armored Kingsguard knights brought forth two massive, iron-bound chests, opening them to reveal the blinding glitter of 100,000 gold dragons. Behind the chests, stewards carried two breathtaking prizes. One was a massive golden chalice, its bowl intricately woven with the intertwined designs of a stag, a viper, a wolf, a lion, a fish, a falcon, and a kraken. The other was a great drinking horn of polished ivory, banded heavily in silver and set with chips of black dragonglass. "Give them their due, Jon," Robert commanded loudly, gesturing to the field where the exhausted Northmen and Crownlanders were gathering. 50,000 dragons to the wolves for the charge, and 50,000 to the stags for the wall. "And give them the cups." Robert then stepped forward, raising his voice so it echoed across the entire arena. "But heed this well. These cups are not yours to melt down or hide in your vaults. I take a page from the Wolf's book today. These are the king's trophies. When the next grand games are called, the victors must bring them back to the field and defend them. They belong only to the strongest." Jon Arryn offered a formal, respectful bow, stepping forward to present the staggering wealth and the royal trophies to the victors. Ned turned to his oldest friend, offering a firm nod as the roar of the crowd swelled to a deafening peak. The king's ransom had been split, the royal coffers had been bled, but as Ned looked out at the muddy, cheering warriors of two distinct kingdoms holding their prizes aloft, he knew the true victory belonged to the peace that had been secured on the bloody, muddy fields of play. Chapter 82: The Smoking Sea. The Grand Royal Games had concluded in a spectacle of mud, blood, and deafening cheers. The immense, newly dug pitch outside the walls of King's Landing had been churned into a brown soup by the competing retinues of the Seven Kingdoms. It had been a triumph of distraction, channeling the martial aggression of a post-war realm into a controlled, highly lucrative arena. But for Eddard Stark, the games had only ever been a grand diversion. 2 days after the final horn had blown, the royal docks of the capital were bathed in the pale, cool light of a cloudy morning. The Winter's Lance sat low in the water, its dark, unpainted ironwood hull absorbing the light, looking more like a submerged blade than a merchant vessel. King Robert Baratheon stood on the stone pier, looking entirely miserable. He was nursing a formidable hangover from the closing feasts, but his foul mood stemmed from more than just sour wine. "You are leaving too soon, Ned," Robert complained, wrapping his heavy, gold-embroidered cloak tighter around his broad shoulders. "The tourney is done, yes, but the real celebrating has just begun. We have a week of feasts planned. Tywin Lannister is paying for half of it, and I intend to drink the other half from the royal treasury." "My place is in the north, Robert," Ned replied smoothly, standing at the base of the gangplank. "The games were magnificent, but Winterfell cannot govern itself indefinitely, and my wife expects me home before the next snows trap us entirely." It was a seamless lie. Ashera knew exactly where he was going, and the north was secure in the hands of Arthur Dayne and Maester Luwin. Jon Arryn stepped forward, looking relieved that at least one Lord Paramount was returning to his duties rather than lingering to drain the capital's larders. "You have done the realm a great service, Lord Stark," Jon said, offering a respectful bow. The games have unified the lords in a way that words never could. I leave it in capable hands, John, Ned said, clasping the older man's forearm. Watch the ledgers, and watch the shadows. Always, John murmured. Robert stepped forward and pulled Ned into a crushing, desperate embrace. Safe voyage, you freezing bastard. Bring that giant cup back next year, or I will come to Winterfell and take it from your mantelpiece myself. You are welcome to try, your grace, Ned smiled, pulling back. Ned turned and walked up the gangplank, followed closely by his brother Benjen. Ned had manned the vessel entirely with 50 elite members of the Wolf Guard. They were his pack, young, intensely loyal warriors who had trained under him. They stood at their stations in absolute eerie silence, their dark gray cloaks blending into the storm-gray canvas of the lateen sails. As the mooring lines were cast off, Ned stood at the high stern, watching Robert and John grow smaller against the backdrop of the Red Keep. He was leaving the safety of the known world behind. He was turning his back on the Game of Thrones to face the nightmare of the Long Night. Set the course, Ned commanded Willem, the captain of the Wolf Guard, who had rigorously trained to navigate the vessel for this exact mission. East, across the narrow sea. The voyage across the narrow sea was swift and unhindered. The Winter's Lance proved to be an absolute marvel of the shipwright's craft. With her narrow beam and deep, lead-weighted keel, she sliced through the autumn gales with a speed that left standard galleys wallowing in her wake. They did not sail for the northern ports of Essos. They bypassed Pentos and Myr entirely, keeping to the deep water, sailing ever southward until the air grew thick, heavy, and intensely humid. They made landfall at Volantis. The oldest and greatest of the free cities straddled the mouth of the Rhoyne River, a sprawling city of immense wealth and staggering cruelty. From the deck of the ship, Ned and Benjen stared up at the black walls, a massive, seamless oval of fused black stone erected by the Valyrian freehold before the Doom. It was a dark reminder of the empire they were sailing toward. It is too hot, Benjen complained, tugging at the collar of his boiled leather tunic. The northern youth was sweating profusely, unaccustomed to the stifling, oppressive heat of the southern continent. The air feels like breathing through a wet wool blanket. It will get hotter, Ned warned softly. They did not linger in the city to admire the Temple of the Lord of Light or the bustling markets of the Long Bridge. Ned had a very specific, carefully curated list of supplies to acquire. He dispatched Willem and a squad of the guard into the markets with heavy purses of silver. They returned hours later with their arms burdened. They carried hundreds of yards of thick, unbleached linen, large clay jugs of strong, biting vinegar, and heavy casks of fresh, clean water. They also procured thick, heat-resistant leathers from the smithing districts, garments usually worn by men who worked the deepest, hottest forges of the city. Vinegar and heavy leather? Willem asked, eyeing the supplies as they were loaded into the hull. My lord, we are sailing into the summer sea. The men will roast in those. If we do not wear them, Willem, we will roast regardless, Ned replied, his face an unreadable mask. We are not sailing the summer sea. We are sailing into the Gulf of Grief. Willem's face paled slightly, but his discipline held firm. The Gulf, my lord? That path leads only to the smoking sea. It is death. We bring our own winter, Ned said, his voice carrying the subtle, unyielding pressure of absolute command. We leave within the hour. They departed Volantis under the cover of early morning, slipping past the great galleys of the local magisters and turning their razor-sharp prow toward the southeast. For 2 days the sailing was normal, albeit uncomfortably hot. But on the dawn of the third day the world began to change. The vibrant, sparkling blue of the ocean gradually muted into a dull, sickly slate gray. The wind, usually a fresh, salty companion, died away completely, leaving the sails hanging slack and lifeless. The air grew perfectly still and suffocatingly thick. Benjen stood at the rail, staring up at the heavens. Ned? The sky. Ned looked up. The sun was rising, but it was not a golden orb. It was a pale, watery disk, struggling to pierce a high, unnatural haze. The sky itself had shifted from blue to a bruised, sickly shade of yellow, tinged with streaks of dirty brown. The smell hit them next. It was faint at first, a sharp, acrid tang at the back of the throat. Within an hour, it grew into a heavy, oppressive stench of rotten eggs, burning copper, and sulfur. Oars! Willem barked from the tiller, his voice sounding thin in the dead air. The Wolf Guard took to the rowing benches without a word of complaint. The rhythmic splashing of the oars was the only sound in the vast, unnatural silence of the Gulf of Grief. The heat became a physical entity. It radiated not from the pale sun, but from the water itself. Ned walked the length of the ship. He ordered the men to strip off their cloaks and heavy tunics, donning the specialized leathers. He directed them to tear the linen into strips and soak them in the vinegar. "Tie them over your mouth and nose," Ned commanded. "It will filter the worst of the ash and the poison." By midday, a thick, rolling fog began to rise from the surface of the sea. It was not the cold, gray mist of the north. It was white, dense, and unnervingly hot. Small, sudden geysers of boiling water occasionally erupted from the calm surface, hissing violently into the humid air. The visibility dropped to less than a stone's throw. The world was reduced to the creaking of the oars and the oppressive yellow-white haze. "The fog is too thick, Lord Stark," Willem called out from the helm, his hands tight on the tiller. "I cannot see the prow, let alone the reefs. I am flying blind." "Keep your hands on the tiller, Willem," Ned commanded quietly, walking to the very tip of the prow. "Follow my directions exactly." Ned closed his eyes. He didn't need to see the rocks. He could feel them. He extended his consciousness into the murky, boiling waters, feeling the jagged, submerged reefs of dragonglass that were said to tear the hulls out of ships navigating the smoking sea. "2 points to port," Ned said, his voice entirely calm. Willem hauled the tiller. The ironwood hull shifted smoothly, avoiding a massive, razor-sharp pillar of obsidian by a matter of feet. "Hold steady. Now 1 point to starboard." Ned navigated them through the impossible maze, acting as a living lodestone and sounding line, his mind illuminating the deadly obstacles hidden in the fog. As they drifted deeper into the ruins of the shattered peninsula, a shape slowly emerged from the swirling steam off their starboard bow. It was a ship, a massive galleon, far larger than their own vessel. Its hull was scorched black, the wood blistered and peeling. Its 3 great masts were snapped and splintered, the rigging hanging down like dead vines in a rotting forest. But it was the remnants of the sails that drew the eye. They were ragged, burnt, and torn, but the colors were still faintly visible. Crimson cloth, bearing the faded, tattered image of a golden lion rampant. "A Lannister ship," Benjen whispered through his vinegar mask, awe and horror mixing in his tone. Ned stared at the ghost ship. He knew exactly what it was. Geryon Lannister, the Laughing Lion, who had sailed into the Doom nearly a few years ago, seeking the lost Valyrian steel sword of his house. Bright roar. Should we search it?" Benjen asked, eyeing the silent, empty decks. "Perhaps they found the blade before they perished." Ned reached out with his senses. He felt no life aboard, but a creeping, oily residue of dark magic clung to the burnt wood. "We will look at it when we exit," Ned decided, his voice hard. "We do not stop our momentum now." But the ruins of Valyria did not let intruders pass easily. As they drifted past the ruined galleon, the true terror of the smoking sea struck. It was not a physical assault. It was a wave of unseen dread. A sudden, agonizing pressure slammed into the minds of the crew. It was the whispers of the Doom, the residual, tormented echoes of millions of souls who had burned alive in blood magic and dragonfire. All around the deck, the men of the Wolf Guard faltered. Several dropped their oars, clutching their heads and crying out. One man stumbled toward the rail, his eyes glassy, muttering about his dead mother calling him into the boiling water. "Hold them back," Benjen yelled, grabbing a delirious guardsman by the tunic and hauling him away from the edge. Ned recognized the mental assault instantly. He dropped to one knee on the prow, slamming his hands onto the deck planks. He didn't strike out, he built a wall. Ned pulled deeply from the pristine ocean of the force within him, expanding his aura outward in a massive, shimmering dome of absolute, serene calm. He projected a spiritual shield over the entirety of the Winter's Lance, violently pushing back the dark, maddening whispers of the cursed sea. The oppressive voices vanished instantly. The men on the deck gasped, shaking their heads as the mental fog cleared, collapsing back onto their benches in exhausted relief. "Keep rowing," Ned shouted, holding the shield steady in his mind, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Do not listen to the fog." They pressed further into the interior, passing the shattered remnants of what was once a towering bridge of fused black stone. Ned remained at the prow, holding the mental shield and guiding the ship, when his senses suddenly spiked with a violent, jagged warning. It wasn't a reef. It wasn't a whisper. It was aggressive, physical intent dropping from the cliffs above. "Shields!" Ned roared, his eyes snapping open. He stood up, drawing his castle-forged longsword in a blur. "Form a circle around the mast. Spears out. Do not break formation." The Wolf Guard, trained to perfection, did not hesitate. The 50 men abandoned the oars, instantly snapping their heavy oak shields together into a tight, impenetrable ring around the mainmast. Spears bristled outward like a deadly urchin. Ned and Ben-Jen did not join the circle. They remained outside it, standing back-to-back in the open space of the deck. Because the crew consisted entirely of their trusted pack, there was no need to hide their true capabilities. From the dense fog above, heavy, thudding impacts began to land on the deck. They were horrific things. Ash ghouls. They had once been human, perhaps slaves or citizens of the Freehold, but the doom had melted them. Their skin was a hardened, charred shell of volcanic rock and gray ash fused with bone. They possessed no eyes, only hollow sockets burning with a dull, mindless malice. They felt no pain, and their touch sizzled with residual heat. A dozen of the monsters scrambled across the deck, letting out dry, rasping hisses, and hurled themselves blindly at the shield wall. The Wolf Guard held firm, their spears punching into the rocky flesh of the ghouls, keeping the abominations at bay but struggling to find vital organs in bodies made of ash. "Keep them pinned," Ned ordered the line. Ned and Ben-Jen went to work. They moved as blurs of gray and steel. Ben-Jen utilized his preternatural speed, darting around the boundary of the shield wall. When a ghoul tried to flank the formation, Ben-Jen was already there. He didn't try to hack through the stone-like skin. He drove his blade into the joints, using enhanced strength to sever limbs and shatter knees. Ned moved with devastating, open power. A massive ghoul lunged for him, its jagged, ash-fused claws outstretched. Ned didn't parry. He raised his left hand and unleashed a massive blast of pure, unseen force. The invisible wall struck the ghoul squarely in the chest. The creature was violently lifted off its feet, hurtling backward through the air and over the rail of the ship, plunging into the boiling sea with a sickening hiss. Another ghoul managed to grab Ben-Jen's sword arm. The creature's touch began to scorch the young lord's leather bracer. Ned pivoted seamlessly, his blade humming. He cleaved the monster's arm off at the elbow, and before the creature could react, he drove a heavy, fortified boot directly into its midsection, kicking it entirely off the deck. They danced around their own men, an unstoppable two-man vanguard. Whenever the shield wall was pressured, Ned or Ben-Jen was there to relieve it, utilizing their impossible speed to cut the monsters down and violently hurl their ruined bodies back into the corrosive waters of the Gulf. Within 5 minutes, the deck was clear. Piles of gray ash and shattered stone were the only evidence of the boarding party. "Hold the line," Ned commanded, breathing steadily, scanning the fog for more falling shadows. When none came, he nodded. "Back to the oars. We are almost there." Suddenly, the dense, white steam parted like a drawn curtain. The oppressive hissing of the boiling sea faded, replaced by an eerie, absolute silence. They had broken through the mists of the smoking sea and reached the interior coastline of the shattered peninsula. Valyria. The sight was breathtaking in its devastation. Rising from the water were the twisted, shattered remnants of what was once the greatest civilization in human history. Towers of fused black stone, melted and warped by unimaginable heat, leaned at impossible angles. The ground itself was a landscape of jagged obsidian, gray ash, and glowing fissures. But the water surrounding the ancient, fused glass pier was a problem. It was not merely boiling. It was a caustic, bubbling sludge of acidic runoff and liquid pitch. "The water will eat the hull if we leave her here, Ned," Ben-Jen noted, leaning over the rail and watching the paint begin to blister near the waterline. "Even the ironwood won't survive a week sitting in that." Ned scanned the coastline. The ancient, massive stone pier jutted out from the shore, wide and flat. "Everyone off the ship," Ned ordered. "Onto the pier. Take the supplies." The Wolf Guard, trusting their lord implicitly, secured lines to the stone bollards and quickly disembarked onto the ancient glass structure, forming a secure perimeter. Once the ship was completely empty, Ned stepped off the gangplank. He walked to the very edge of the pier, facing the Winter's Lance. The ship was sleek, but it still weighed several tons. "Stand back," Ned warned his brother. Ned planted his boots firmly on the ancient stone. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, centering breath. He reached deep into the core of his power, pushing past his tenfold enhancements, tapping into the absolute limits of his physical and mental endurance. He raised both hands, his palms facing the hull of the vessel. The water around the Winter's Lance began to churn and froth. The heavy ironwood timbers groaned loudly. Slowly, agonizingly, the ship began to rise. Water poured from her keel in thick, boiling sheets. Ned's teeth were gritted in a feral snarl, sweat instantly freezing on his brow despite the ambient heat. The veins in his neck and forearms bulged as he bore the immense, impossible weight with nothing but his mind. He elevated the ship a full 10 feet out of the corrosive sludge. With a slow, sweeping motion of his arms, he physically pivoted the entire vessel in the air, bringing it over the solid, fused stone of the massive pier. With a final, trembling exhale, Ned lowered his arms. The Winter's Lance settled onto the dry, ancient stone with a heavy, resonating thud, safe from the boiling rot of the sea. Ned dropped to one knee, gasping for air, the sheer magnitude of the exertion leaving his limbs shaking. Ben-Jen rushed forward, grabbing his brother's shoulder to steady him. The Wolf Guard stared in absolute, silent reverence. They had known he was powerful, but this was the strength of gods. "I'm fine," Ned wheezed, waving Ben-Jen off and slowly forcing himself back to his feet. He looked at the ship, secure on the stone, and then turned his gaze toward the ruined, ash-choked interior of Valyria. "Secure the camp," Ned ordered, his voice returning to its sharp, commanding edge. "We are going to explore a bit." Chapter 83, The Oasis in the Ash. The silence of Valyria was not the peaceful quiet of a snow-draped forest, nor the respectful hush of an empty September. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard that had been burned to ash. "Form up," Ned commanded, his voice muted by the heavy, vinegar-soaked linen tied securely across his nose and mouth. "Tight formation. No man steps where I have not stepped first." Behind him, the 50 men of the Wolf Guard arranged themselves into a disciplined wedge. Their gray cloaks were already gathering a fine dusting of soot. They held their short swords drawn, their eyes wide with a perfectly justified dread. Ben-Jen took the rear guard, his hand resting on the hilt of Winter's Tide. The ruins of the port city loomed ahead. It was a labyrinth of melted architecture. Towers that must have once scraped the sky were now slumped over like dripping wax candles, their stone fused into grotesque, unnatural shapes by heat that defied comprehension. The streets were jagged fissures of black dragonglass and cooled lava. "Keep your eyes sharp," Ned murmured, raising a hand to halt the column as they approached the mouth of a wide, ruined avenue. Ned closed his eyes. He did not draw his sword. He pushed his awareness outward, sinking it directly into the ground beneath their feet. He wasn't looking for enemies. The surface felt utterly devoid of life. He was looking for the malice of the earth itself. His mind penetrated the crust of the ash. Instantly, he felt the violent, chaotic instability of the doom. The ground here was not solid. It was a brittle shell. Directly ahead, running straight down the center of the avenue they were about to cross, Ned felt a massive, hollow void. The crust of ash was perhaps 2 inches thick. Beneath it lay a sheer drop of 50 feet, ending in a sluggishly moving river of molten rock. If a heavily armored man had stepped on that ash, the crust would have shattered instantly, plunging him into the magma below. "Veer left," Ned ordered, opening his eyes and pointing toward a ridge of solid, fused basalt that skirted the edge of the hidden chasm. "Tread only on the black stone. The gray ash is a lie." The men obeyed without question, shuffling nervously onto the hard, uneven rock. They moved deeper into the ruins, the oppressive heat radiating through the soles of their boots. The air was thick and hazy, the sky above a bruised, swirling canopy of purple and bruised red. Suddenly, Ned felt a sharp, stinging sensation at the edge of his sensory net. It was not heat, but a dense, heavy pocket of air settling in a sunken plaza just ahead. It smelled faintly sweet, like rotting fruit and copper. "Halt!" Ned commanded sharply. He stared at the plaza. The air within the shallow depression shimmered with a faint, oily mirage. Toxic gas, Ned realized, heavier than the surrounding air, pooling in the low ground. To walk through it would burn their lungs to cinders in seconds, vinegar masks or not. "We cannot cross the plaza," Ned said. "We must go around, my lord?" asked Willem, stepping up beside him, his eyes watering from the ambient sulfur. To go around is to walk blindly into another trap, Ned said. He raised his right hand, his palm facing the sunken square. He breathed in, gathering the ambient energy, focusing it into a dense wall of pure force. Ned thrust his hand forward. He didn't emit a blast of air. He created a localized pressure wave. The invisible wall slammed into the pocket of toxic gas, violently sweeping the heavy, sweet-smelling fumes out of the depression and dispersing them into the higher, swirling winds above the city ruins. The shimmering mirage vanished. Move quickly, Ned instructed, lowering his hand, before the vent refills the basin. For 3 agonizing hours, they charted the immediate edges of the port city. Ned acted as a human-sounding line, using his heightened senses to map the hidden magma tubes, the unstable ground, and the venting fissures of poisonous air. They mapped safe paths, marking the solid basalt with chalk, creating a secure foothold extending half a mile from the docks. There is nothing living here, Ben-Jen observed, coming up to walk beside Ned as they stood before the melted remnants of what might have once been a grand temple. No birds, no insects, just silence. The doom burned the life from the stones, Ned agreed, his gaze sweeping the jagged horizon. But the deeper we go, the closer we get to the 14 flames. The magic there is thicker, and magic breeds complications. Ned turned back toward the dark water. The sky was beginning to darken, the bruised purple giving way to a deep, fiery black as the glow of the distant volcanoes illuminated the clouds from below. We fall back, Ned ordered. The camp is secure. We rest on the glass. They returned to the massive, fused glass pier where the winter's lance sat safely elevated from the acidic, boiling water of the harbor. The men did not build a fire. To light a flame in a place that smelled so heavily of sulfur and volatile gases seemed an invitation to disaster. Instead, they huddled on the solid stone beneath the shadow of their ship's hull. The mood was tense. The Wolf Guard were the finest warriors in the north, fearless in the face of wildlings or armored knights. But Valyria was a graveyard that actively tried to kill them with every step. The sheer unnaturalness of the environment gnawed at their nerves. Ned sat cross-legged near the gangplank, tearing a strip of dried, salted beef with his teeth. He chewed methodically, washing it down with a swig of water from his skin. The water tasted flat, completely devoid of the crispness of the northern springs. But it was safe. Ben-Jen sat beside him. "It likes this place," Ben-Jen murmured, tracing the rippled pattern of the metal. "The sword feels lighter here," Ned quietly said. "The magic in the steel remembers the magic in the earth. Keep it sheathed, Ben. Do not let it draw too much attention." Ben-Jen nodded, sliding the blade back into its scabbard. "How far do we march tomorrow?" "We follow the ancient roads," Ned said, pulling a rough, hand-drawn map from his tunic. It was a map he had pieced together from the knowledge of the ancient citadel texts he had studied in Winterfell. The Dragon Lords built their greatest vaults inland, nestled in the foothills of the 14 Flames. "We will push 3 times the distance we covered today. We will not find what we seek in a merchant's port." "The men are anxious," Ben-Jen noted, looking at the gray-cloaked warriors eating their hardtack in silence. "They should be," Ned said. "Fear keeps the mind sharp. Only fools walk into the ashes without trembling." Ned stood up, brushing the crumbs from his leather trousers. He walked the perimeter of their makeshift camp, offering a grounding nod to his men. He projected a steady, slow pulse of calm into the force, acting as a spiritual anchor for his pack in the dark. "Rest," Ned commanded them. "Sleep in shifts. Tomorrow we walk into the heart of the fire." When the sky lightened to a sickly, pale yellow the next morning, the camp was already packed and ready to move. The men adjusted their vinegar-soaked masks, tightening the straps of their boiled leather armor. They carried extra water skins, knowing that the deeper they marched, the hotter the air would become. Ned took the point once more. They left the safe ground they had charted yesterday and ventured into the true unknown. The journey was grueling. The further inland they traveled, the more the landscape defied reason. They walked along the remnants of a massive, elevated Valyrian road. The fused stone was cracked and broken in places, forcing them to navigate precarious drops, but it kept them above the treacherous, ash-filled valleys below. They were passing through what must have once been a dense, aristocratic district. Massive, shattered domes and the hollowed-out husks of great manses lined the broken road. Suddenly, the very bedrock groaned. It was not the subtle, settling shift of ruined stone. A deafening, catastrophic roar echoed from a jagged peak a mile to the east. The ground shook violently beneath their boots. A massive plume of black smoke, streaked with vivid orange fire, shot miles into the bruised sky. Eruption! Willem shouted over the trembling earth. Shields! Ned bellowed, his voice carrying absolute authority over the panic. Form the iron shell. Lock them tight above. The Wolf Guard did not scatter. They instantly collapsed their formation into a tight, overlapping square, raising their heavy, iron-bound oak shields over their heads to form an impenetrable wooden roof. Then the sky rained knives and fire. Shards of razor-sharp dragonglass and flaming chunks of pumice pelted the shield wall, thudding and hissing violently against the wet wood. The men grunted under the concussive impacts, bracing their arms to keep the canopy intact. Ned and Benjen did not seek the shelter of the shields. They stood exposed on either side of the formation, their cloaks whipping in the sudden, hot gale generated by the volcanic burst. A shadow fell over the men. A flaming boulder, easily the size of a merchant's heavy supply wagon, was plummeting from the sky directly toward the center of the shield roof. It carried enough weight to crush a dozen men instantly. Ned raised his left hand. He didn't brace, he simply anchored his mind and pushed. A massive, unseen wave of pure force slammed into the falling rock mid-air, violently altering its path. The flaming boulder was deflected, crashing heavily into the side of a ruined dome 50 yards away, showering the valley below in harmless, glowing sparks and shattered stone. Benjen mirrored the action on the opposite flank, thrusting both hands forward to send a smaller, but equally deadly chunk of molten rock spinning harmlessly into the canyon. For 10 agonizing minutes, the brothers stood as an invisible aegis against the wrath of the mountain, continually deflecting the heaviest, most lethal projectiles, until the fiery rain finally subsided into a gentle fall of gray, choking ash. "Lower shields," Ned commanded, wiping a streak of black soot from his brow. The men lowered their battered, scorched shields, looking at their lord and his brother with wide, reverent eyes. "Keep the pace steady," Ned said, his breathing slightly elevated from the massive exertion of the force. "We do not linger beneath active peaks." They marched for another hour. The air grew steadily hotter, baking the sweat onto their skin. Rivers of sluggish, cooling magma flowed through the shattered canyons beneath them, glowing with a dull, angry orange light. "We are 3 leagues in," Willem reported, stepping carefully over a deep fissure in the road. "Thrice the distance of yesterday." Suddenly, Ned stopped dead in his tracks. He raised a clenched fist. The column behind him halted instantly, boots freezing on the stone. Ned closed his eyes. The force was screaming. It was not the slow, passive danger of a magma tube or the sudden burst of a mountain. It was active. It was aggressive. And it was hot. A dozen distinct, jagged signatures of life suddenly flared into his awareness. They felt ancient, corrupted, and intensely hungry. They were moving through the ash of the valley below, scrambling up the steep incline toward the elevated road. "Draw bows," Ned commanded, his voice slicing through the heavy air. "Knock arrows. Something is approaching from the right flank." The Wolf Guard moved with flawless discipline. The front 2 ranks dropped to one knee, drawing short, heavy northern recurve bows. The ranks behind them stood tall, drawing their bowstrings back to their cheeks. The sound of 50 creaking bowstrings was the only noise in the dead city. The men were tense. The air itself seemed to vibrate with impending violence. "What is it, my lord?" Willem whispered, his arrow trained on the rocky lip of the road. "The Children of the Doom," Ned said grimly, drawing ice from the scabbard on his back. The massive Valyrian greatsword hummed, recognizing the threat. A shower of loose ash and pebbles cascaded over the edge of the road. Then the creatures pulled themselves over the lip. They were horrors born of blood magic and the lingering blight of the doom. They were the size of large hounds, their bodies covered in thick, dark gray scales that looked like cooled lava. They possessed long, serpentine necks and wedge-shaped heads lined with needle-sharp, obsidian teeth. But it was their limbs that spoke of their tragic, corrupted lineage. Sprouting from their backs were leathery, bat-like wings, but they were atrophied, riddled with holes, and entirely useless for flight. They dragged these ruined wings behind them as they scuttled forward on 4 heavily clawed, muscular legs. "Fire WYRMS," Ned thought. The creatures let out a chorus of high, rasping shrieks. Smoke curled from their nostrils, smelling of burning sulfur. "Hold," Ned commanded, keeping his hand raised as the beasts scrambled onto the road, their claws clacking against the stone. The archers held their breath, their muscles trembling with the strain of the drawn bows. The creatures hissed, their pale, blind eyes locking onto the heat signatures of the Northmen. They bunched their hind legs, preparing to leap. "Release!" Ned roared. 50 bowstrings snapped in perfect unison, the air filled with the sharp hiss of northern steel. At this close range, the heavy, iron-tipped arrows struck with devastating, crushing weight. The volley tore into the leading rank of the WYRMS. Scales shattered. Black, boiling blood sprayed into the air. Several of the beasts shrieked in agony as shafts pinned them to the stone, their limbs thrashing wildly as they died. "Draw swords!" Ned shouted, as the surviving half of the pack, 6 infuriated, bleeding monsters, leaped entirely over the fallen bodies of their kin, lunging directly at the shield line. "With me, Ben-Jen," Ned ordered. The 2 Starks stepped out from the protective formation of the archers, placing themselves directly in the path of the charging horrors. A WYRM launched itself through the air, its jaws unhinging to reveal a glowing molten orange heat deep within its throat. It was preparing to expel a gout of corrosive flame. Ned didn't flinch. He blurred forward, moving faster than the creature's corrupted instincts could track. He brought ice around in a massive, sweeping horizontal arc. The dark, smoke-rippled Valyrian steel sheared cleanly through the creature's thick scales, severing its serpentine neck before the flame could ever leave its throat. The headless body crashed into the stone, twitching violently. Beside him, Ben-Jen faced 2 of the beasts. He did not possess Ned's sheer, overwhelming physical speed, but he possessed the immovable defense. As a WYRM lunged for his legs, Ben-Jen rooted his stance, slamming his heavy oak shield down to crush the creature's skull against the rock. The second beast leapt for his chest. Ben-Jen thrust his left hand forward. A localized wave of unseen power slammed into the leaping WYRM midair. The creature shrieked as its forward leap was violently reversed, hurling it backward over the edge of the elevated road to plummet into the magma-filled canyon below. With a smooth, practiced motion, Ben-Jen drew Winter's Tide. He drove the blade cleanly through the skull of the beast he had pinned with his shield. The remaining 3 WYRMs crashed into the front line of the Wolfguard. The Northmen did not break. They locked their shields, absorbing the heavy impacts of the scuttling beasts, and drove their short swords into the gaps between the hardened scales. Piles of steaming, black-blooded carcasses littered the Valyrian road. "Excellent discipline," Ned praised, breathing evenly as he flicked the corrosive blood from ice. "They were degraded, starving. If they had possessed the power of flight, we would be ash." But the force screamed a second warning, far louder and more violent than the first. The stone road beneath their boots violently buckled. "Scatter!" Ned roared. The men dove for the edges of the road as the fused stone erupted outward with the force of a battering ram. From the depths of the earth burst a nightmare. It was a fire WYRM, but IIT was the size of a river galley, its immense body plated in thick, overlapping scales of fused basalt that looked harder than steel. It lacked wings entirely, but its jaws were wide enough to swallow a horse whole, glowing with an intense, internal furnace heat that scorched the air around it. This was the Mother, and she was furious. The archers instinctively loosed a volley. The heavy iron arrows simply sparked and shattered against her stone armor, entirely useless. "Swords are useless against that hide," Ned commanded, his mind racing through tactical options. The climbing lines. Pin the beast. The Wolfguard, trained to adapt instantly, dropped their bows and uncoiled the heavy hempen ropes fitted with iron grappling hooks they used for scaling walls and securing ships. Moving with the synchronized, fearless bravery of men accustomed to hunting leviathans in the shivering sea, they hurled the hooks. The iron caught in the crevices of the WRM's stony armor, wrapping tightly around its thick, thrashing legs and massive neck. "Heave!" Willem screamed. 50 men hauled on the ropes, using their entire body weight and leveraging themselves against jagged spires of ruined masonry to drag the massive creature down. The beast shrieked, a sound like grinding earth, struggling violently against the heavy bindings. "The eyes, Ben-Jen!" Ned shouted. "Take its sight!" Ben-Jen blurred into motion. He didn't try to hack at the armored hide. He used the distraction of the straining ropes to sprint directly toward the snapping jaws. With a flawless, sliding evasion, He dodged a gout of scalding steam expelled from its nostrils, lunged upward, and drove the blade of Winter's Tide in a sharp, horizontal slash across the beast's pale, blind sensory pits. The Valyrian steel bit deep. The monster thrashed wildly, blinded and screaming in absolute agony, its movements becoming chaotic and uncoordinated. It was the opening Ned needed. He grasped the long hilt of ice with both hands. Ned crouched low and exploded upward. The impossible leap carried him 30 feet into the air, soaring high above the thrashing, armor-plated monster. He reached the apex of his arc, momentarily suspended against the bruised yellow sky. With a primal roar, Ned brought the massive Valyrian greatsword down, using the sheer momentum of his descent and the unnatural strength of his arms. Ice plunged directly into the center of the Mother Wrm's skull, driving straight through the thick bone plate and burying itself to the heavy crossguard. The beast stiffened, a final, shuddering breath escaping its furnace jaws in a cloud of thick steam, before collapsing heavily onto the ruined road, dead. Ned wrenched his sword free, landing heavily on the beast's back. The men stared in silent, breathless awe at the slain behemoth and the lord who had felled it from the sky. "We press on," Ned commanded, stepping down from the carcass. "Keep your eyes on the shadows. The mother is dead, but her den is close." They marched for another hour, moving deeper into the foothills of the colossal, dormant volcanoes that dominated the interior. The heat was becoming unbearable, forcing the men to drink deeply from their diminishing water supplies. Ned led the column, his senses stretched to their absolute limit. But as they were walking, something changed. The abrasive, chaotic discord of the doom that had assaulted his mind for the past 2 days suddenly shifted. It didn't vanish, but it parted, revealing a pocket of something entirely different. It was a feeling, a deep resonance in the force. Felt pleasant, felt like cool water flowing over hot stone. It felt remarkably like the ancient, heavy peace of the gods would in Winterfell, but older, and entirely devoid of the cold. Ned stopped. He closed his eyes, tilting his head as if listening to a distant song. "Brother," Benjen asked, stepping up, sensing his brother's sudden shift in demeanor. "Do you feel that?" Ned murmured. Benjen closed his eyes, dropping his awareness into his center. A moment later, his eyes snapped open in surprise. "It feels clean. The air ahead. It doesn't burn." "Follow me," Ned said, his pace quickening. He didn't rely on the map anymore. He followed the pull in the force, letting the pleasant, ringing sensation guide him through a maze of shattered canyons and melted archways. They rounded a massive outcropping of fused, black glass, and the entire column came to a staggering, awestruck halt. They had expected to find a grand, ruined vault of stone, or a subterranean cave of unimaginable horrors. What they found was impossible. Nestled in the center of a deep, crater-like valley, completely surrounded by the devastation of the doom, was a sprawling, vibrant expanse of green. It was an oasis. Lush, towering trees with leaves of vibrant emerald and pale silver grew in dense, healthy clusters. Soft, mossy grass blanketed the ground, entirely free of the gray, suffocating ash that covered the rest of the continent. Through the center of the greenery ran a crystal-clear stream of fresh water, bubbling up from a deep, subterranean spring that somehow bypassed the magma flows entirely. The air within the crater was fundamentally different. The yellow, sulfurous haze stopped at the perimeter, held back by an invisible, shimmering barrier of pure, sustained magic. Inside the oasis, the sky above seemed clearer, and the air smelled of sweet blossoms and wet earth. "By the old gods," Willem whispered, slowly pulling the vinegar-soaked mask down from his face. He took a tentative breath. "The air, it is pure." The 50 men of the Wolf Guard stood frozen, staring at the pocket of life thriving in the center of hell. Ned stepped forward, walking over the threshold. The moment he crossed the invisible boundary, the oppressive, crushing heat of Valyria vanished. A cool, refreshing breeze brushed his face. The connection to the force here was staggering. It was a wellspring of raw, uncorrupted light magic, preserved in a bubble of ancient intent. "It's a sanctuary," Benjen said, stepping in beside him, his eyes wide as he looked at the vibrant flora. "How did it survive the fire?" "It didn't survive it. It defied it," Ned said, looking toward the center of the lush valley. Through the silver leaves of the ancient trees, Ned could see the unmistakable lines of worked stone. Not the melted, warped remnants of the city outside, but pristine, perfectly preserved architecture. He turned to his men, who were tentatively stepping into the cool, clean air of the oasis, unbuckling their heavy leathers and drinking in the miraculous atmosphere. "Rest here," Ned commanded, pointing to the banks of the clear stream. "Drink the water, breathe the air. We have found the center." He looked back toward the pristine stone structures hidden deep within the trees. "The destination is just ahead, and tomorrow we search for treasures." Chapter 84, The Sanctuary in the Ash. The contrast was so absolute it defied reason. One moment, they had been marching through a hellscape of jagged obsidian, boiling mud, and the terrifying, unnatural heat of the ruined Valyrian peninsula. The next, they had crossed an invisible, shimmering threshold into a sanctuary that felt entirely detached from the dying world around it. Eddard Stark stepped fully into the oasis, the heavy, sulfur-choked air vanishing the instant he crossed the perimeter. It was replaced by a cool, fragrant breeze that smelled of sweet blossoms, damp earth, and ancient pine. Above them, the sky within the boundaries of the oasis was clear, a vibrant blue completely untouched by the bruised, yellow-purple haze of the doom that raged just outside the magical dome. The 50 men of the Wolf Guard stood frozen, their hands gripping their weapons tightly, staring at the lush, towering trees with leaves of vibrant emerald and pale silver. Soft, mossy grass blanketed the ground, fed by a crystal-clear stream that bubbled up from a deep, subterranean spring. "Do not lower your guard," Willem, the captain, ordered softly, his eyes darting to the thickest patches of vegetation. "Illusions can hide daggers." "It is no illusion, Willem," Ned said, his voice calm and steady. Ned closed his eyes. He let his awareness drop past his physical senses, plunging deep into the silent, unseen currents that bound the world together. He cast a wide, sweeping net of his spiritual perception across the entire span of the crater-like valley. He searched for the jagged, angry red spikes of hostile intent. He searched for the heavy, corrupted signatures of the ash ghouls or the terrifying internal furnace of the fire WYRMS. He found absolutely nothing. The energy within the oasis was a deep, pristine pool of tranquility. It was ancient, heavy with preservation, completely devoid of malice. It felt like the heart of the gods would in Winterfell, magnified 1,000 times over. "The surroundings are clear," Ned announced, opening his gray eyes. He turned to the bewildered men of his guard. "The magic that sustains this place keeps the horrors of the peninsula at bay. We are safe here." A collective, shuddering sigh of relief ran through the ranks of the Wolf Guard. "Set up the camp," Ned commanded, pointing to a wide, flat expanse of mossy ground near the winding stream. "We rest for a time. Drink the water. It is pure. Eat the rations we brought." The men did not need to be told twice. They immediately shed their heavy, vinegar-soaked face masks, breathing in the sweet air like drowning men breaking the surface. They unbuckled their boiled leather armor, splashed the cool, clear water on their soot-stained faces, and began to pitch the small, functional tents they carried in their packs. Benjen Stark walked over to the stream, kneeling to splash water over his face and through his dark hair. He looked up at Ned, wiping his jaw. "How does this exist, Ned?" Benjen asked, his voice hushed with awe. "The rest of the continent was melted into slag. Mountains were shattered. How did a garden survive the greatest fire the world has ever known?" "That is what we are going to find out," Ned replied, unfastening his own heavy cloak and draping it over a low branch. They ate a simple, quiet meal of dried beef and hardtack. The food was tasteless and tough, but sitting in the cool shade of the silverleaf trees made it feel like a feast. The men relaxed, their tense muscles unwinding, the terrifying encounters with the creatures of the ash slowly fading into memory. After an hour of rest, Ned stood up. He felt completely refreshed. "Leave the tents," Ned commanded, his voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet camp. "Form up. We do not rest for the night until we have explored the heart of this sanctuary. Bring torches and your weapons, but leave the heavy packs." The Wolf Guard assembled quickly, their discipline returning instantly. Ned took the point, with Benjen and Willem flanking him. They left the camp behind, following the gentle curve of the crystal stream deeper into the dense, vibrant greenery. The walk was short, but every step was filled with an eerie beauty. They passed flowers with petals of deep sapphire and glowing gold, blooms that had likely been extinct in the rest of the world for centuries. As they crested a small, moss-covered rise, the trees abruptly parted. The entire company came to a sudden, staggering halt. Before them lay a structure that defied the ravages of time. It was not a ruin. It was not melted, warped, or cracked by the unimaginable heat that had destroyed the surrounding city. It was a temple, pristine and perfect, constructed entirely of flawless black marble. The structure was massive, its high, vaulted roof supported by thick columns carved to resemble the twisting, elegant bodies of dragons in flight. But what stole the breath from their lungs were the veins running through the black stone. They were not veins of quartz or lesser minerals. They were veins of pure, unadulterated gold, webbing across the entire surface of the temple like lightning frozen in the night sky. Flanking the broad, polished steps leading up to the entrance were colossal statues of ancient dragon lords. They were carved from pale alabaster, standing 30 feet tall, depicting ethereal men and women with sharp, aristocratic features, their hands resting upon the hilts of stone swords. "By the old gods," Willem whispered, staring up at the sheer wealth and impossible craftsmanship of the structure. At the top of the stairs stood the main doors. They were immense, twice the height of a mounted knight, constructed of dark, petrified wood and banded entirely in shimmering, smoke-dark Valyrian steel. Ned walked up the steps, his boots making no sound on the polished black marble. He reached the doors. They were not locked. With a firm push, the ancient hinges, perfectly balanced and completely free of rust, yielded silently. The heavy doors swung inward. Ned stepped inside, followed closely by Ben-Jen and the vanguard of the Wolfguard. The men raised their torches, throwing dancing light into the cavernous interior. The grand hall of the temple was breathtaking. The floor was a mosaic of colored glass and polished gemstones, depicting the lands and seas of the ancient Valyrian freehold at the absolute height of its power. The air inside was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of old parchment and dormant incense. But it was the perimeter of the vast hall that held their attention. Arranged in a massive circle along the walls were 14 colossal statues. They were not statues of men or kings. They were dragons. Each statue was distinct, carved from a single massive piece of precious or semi-precious stone. One was carved entirely from blood-red ruby, its wings spread wide in a posture of fury. Another was formed of deep, oceanic sapphire, curled gracefully upon a stone pedestal. There were dragons of jade, of black onyx, of pale moonstone, and of glittering amethyst. The craftsmanship was so intricate that the scales seemed to ripple in the torchlight, the eyes of the beasts glowing with an inner, captivating light. Ben-Jen walked slowly toward the center of the hall, turning in a slow circle as he counted the magnificent beasts. 14, Ben-Jen murmured, his voice echoing softly in the vast space. He looked at Ned, his gray eyes wide with historical realization. The 14 flames. These must be the 14 dragon gods of the ancient Valyrian religion. A pantheon of fire and blood, Ned agreed, looking up at the towering statue of black onyx. He turned his gaze back to his men. They were standing in a tight cluster near the doors, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer, incomprehensible majesty of the place. To men born in the rough, Spartan harshness of the winter town, this temple was a vision of heaven. "Spread out," Ned commanded, breaking the spell. "Search the place. Look for side chambers, vaults, or altars. Look for anything of value, but touch nothing until I have inspected it. Report back if you find a sealed passage." The Wolfguard nodded, shaking off their awe, and broke into squads of 5, raising their torches and moving systematically along the edges of the massive, circular hall. Ned and Ben-Jen walked slowly through the center of the room, their boots clicking against the gemstone mosaic. "This place was preserved for a reason," Ned said quietly. "A temple of this magnitude would hold more than just statues. The Dragon Lords valued magic and steel above all else. This is a reliquary." They had searched for nearly half an hour when a voice echoed from the far end of the hall, behind the massive statue of the Jade Dragon. "Lord Stark, Lord Ben-Jen." It was Willem. His voice was tight with urgency. Ned and Ben-Jen moved swiftly across the hall, weaving between the towering stone beasts. They found Willem and his squad standing before an archway that led into a deep, recessed alcove at the very back of the temple. At the end of the short corridor within the alcove stood a door. It was not like the grand, wooden entrance doors. This door was a single, seamless slab of solid, dark gray metal, completely smooth save for a series of glowing, ancient Valyrian glyphs etched into its center. There were no hinges visible. There was no keyhole. There was no handle. "It is set directly into the stone of the mountain behind the temple, my lord," Willem reported, stepping aside. "We checked the edges. It is a solid block. There is no way to pry it open, and battering it would take a siege ram." Benjen ran a hand over the smooth, cold surface of the metal. "It looks like Valyrian steel, or something similar. It is locked tight. Perhaps there is a hidden lever, or a mechanism linked to the statues in the main hall." Ned did not step forward to search for hidden levers. He did not look for a key. He stepped back, planting his boots firmly on the polished floor. "Stand clear," Ned commanded. Willem, Benjen, and the guards quickly backed away, giving the Lord of Winterfell a wide berth. They had seen him fight. They had seen him catch a falling man with one hand. They knew better than to question his methods. Ned focused his gaze on the massive slab of metal. He raised both of his hands, his palms facing the seamless door. Ned tightened his hands into fists. The air in the corridor grew impossibly heavy. A deafening, agonizing groan of bending metal echoed through the alcove. The glowing Valyrian glyphs upon the door flared brightly, then shattered like glass as the magical wards were violently overloaded by the sheer, overwhelming pressure of Ned's will. With a sound like a thunderclap, the massive, foot-thick slab of metal was ripped entirely from its housing. The internal locking bars sheared off with explosive force, raining sparks against the stone. Ned swept his arms to the side in a sharp, tearing motion. The massive door, weighing several tons, was violently wrenched out of the archway, hovering in the air for a fraction of a second before Ned casually threw it against the wall of the corridor. It hit the stone with a catastrophic crash, leaving the entrance to the vault wide open. Ned slowly lowered his hands. He did not pant. A bead of sweat did not even form on his brow. His tenfold gift had elevated his capacity to the point where tearing open a Braavosi iron-cap strongbox felt no more taxing than lifting a wooden chair. The wolf guards stared at the ruined door, their mouths hanging open in sheer, unadulterated shock. They worshipped Ned's strength, but this was a display of godhood. "The door is open," Ned said mildly, drawing his long sword. "Let us see what the Dragon Lords deemed worthy of locking away." Ned stepped over the threshold, followed by Benjen and the rest of the guard, who raised their torches high to pierce the absolute darkness of the vault. As the flickering orange light washed over the cavernous chamber, the breath caught collectively in 50 throats. The vault was impossibly vast, carved directly into the heart of the dormant volcano, and it was full. To the immediate left and right were literal mountains of gold. The coins were not the golden dragons of the Targaryen dynasty. They were older, heavier, stamped with the faces of the Valyrian Sphinx and the high archons of the Freehold. There were thousands upon thousands of them, overflowing from rotted wooden chests, spilling across the floor in glittering golden dunes. There were chalices of solid gold encrusted with rubies, heavy necklaces of platinum and emeralds, and torques of braided silver. It was enough wealth to buy the 7 kingdoms 10 times over. But as Ned's eyes adjusted, he saw past the mundane gold. The true treasure of the vault lay deeper within. Arranged upon heavy racks of petrified wood was an arsenal of unimaginable power. There were hundreds of weapons, perfectly preserved in the dry, sealed air. They were all forged of dark, smoke-rippled Valyrian steel. There were massive greatswords, elegant longswords, slender rapiers, and curved daggers. There were heavy battle axes with double-sided blades, and fearsome warhammers banded in dark metal that seemed to hum with lethal intent. Beyond the weapon racks stood a dozen armor stands. The armor was not plate or mail. It was a dark, flexible scale armor, forged entirely of Valyrian steel, accented with gold and deep crimson. It was light enough for a man to run in all day, yet hard enough to deflect the direct blow of a heavy lance. Stacked near the back wall, piled like common cordwood, were hundreds of crude, rectangular blocks. "Ingots," Benjen whispered, walking forward in a daze, reaching out to trace the rippled pattern on one of the dark blocks. "Raw Valyrian steel. Gods, Ned, we could forge 1,000 spear tips from this alone. We could arm the entire vanguard." In the very center of the vast chamber, elevated upon a circular dais of white marble, lay the rarest artifacts of all. Resting upon velvet cushions that had miraculously survived the centuries were 5 petrified dragon eggs. They were massive, the size of a man's head, scaled in brilliant colors. One deep emerald green, one pitch black with crimson veins, one pale gold, one sea blue, and one a shocking pearlescent white. Beside the eggs lay 2 massive, twisted horns banded in red gold and dark steel, dragonbinder horns, adorned with glowing Valyrian glyphs, and surrounding the dais, standing like silent sentinels, were 6 tall, twisted pillars of sharp, black obsidian, glass candles. The silence in the vault was broken by the sound of heavy, rapid breathing. Ned turned from the central dais. He looked at the men of the Wolf Guard, the 50 young warriors, forged in the harsh, freezing poverty of the north, were staring at the mountains of gold and the legendary weapons with wide, feverish eyes. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the wealth before them was staggering. It was a temptation that could shatter the discipline of even the most hardened knight. Ned felt the shift in their auras. The cool, disciplined gray of their loyalty was rapidly being clouded by jagged spikes of yellow and sickly green. Greed, avarice, the sudden, overwhelming realization that a handful of those ancient coins could buy them castles of their own in the south. A man took a tentative step toward a pile of gold, his hand reaching out. Ned did not shout. He did not draw his sword. He allowed the absolute terrifying aura of the winter wolf to slip its leash. He projected his power outward, not as a physical push, but as a suffocating spiritual pressure. The temperature in the vault instantly plummeted, their breath turning to thick white clouds. The flickering torchlight dimmed as if terrified of the sudden, oppressive darkness that radiated from the Lord of Winterfell. It was a heavy, crushing weight that hit the men like a physical blow. The wolf guards gasped, their knees buckling under the sheer, unseen pressure. Within seconds, all 50 men, including the highly disciplined Willem, were driven to their knees on the stone floor, their heads bowed, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming primal authority bearing down upon them. The gold fever vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, instinctual terror and an absolute, unshakable reverence. "Look at me," Ned commanded. His voice was quiet, but it vibrated through the stones, echoing in the marrow of their bones. The men forced their heads up, looking at their lord with wide, terrified eyes. "Do not let the gold blind you," Ned said slowly, retracting the crushing weight just enough to let them breathe, but keeping the cold, commanding aura firmly in place. "Gold is heavy. Gold makes men soft. Gold breeds betrayal." He pointed toward the racks of dark, rippling steel. "We did not cross the boiling sea for shiny coins," Ned stated. "We came for the steel. We came for the weapons that will save the world when the true winter falls. I know what is in your hearts. I know what a blade of Valyrian steel means to a warrior." Ned looked across the kneeling ranks of his most elite soldiers. "Think carefully before you allow greed to make you do something stupid," Ned warned, his voice turning into a solemn promise. "Because I assure you, every single man in the Wolfguard who stands by my side until the end will walk away wielding a blade of that ancient steel." The men stared at him. The promise was staggering. To arm a common-born guard with Valyrian steel was unheard of in the history of Westeros. It secured their absolute, fanatical devotion instantly. The gold meant nothing compared to the glory of wielding the legendary metal. "Do not take a single coin without my explicit command," Ned finished. "Do you understand?" "For the wolf," Willem shouted, slamming his fist against his chest, completely free of the momentary temptation. "For the wolf!" The remaining 49 men echoed in a deafening, unified roar of absolute loyalty. Ned withdrew his aura completely. The temperature in the room normalized, and the torches flared bright once more. "Stand up," Ned said gently. "We have much to organize." Leaving Benjen and Willem to begin cataloging the staggering amount of raw ingots and weaponry, Ned walked toward the elevated central dais. He ignored the dragon eggs and the massive horns. His eyes were drawn inexorably to the tall, twisted pillars of black obsidian. The glass candles. The maesters of the citadel possessed a few, but they were dead, cold stones they used to mock acolytes attempting to learn magic. But these candles, resting in the very heart of Valyria, felt different. They hummed with a faint, dormant energy, waiting for a spark. Ned reached out and wrapped his large, calloused hand around the sharp, twisted shaft of the tallest candle. It was cold to the touch. Ned closed his eyes. He simply drew upon the force within him and pushed a steady stream of it into the dragonglass. The reaction was instantaneous. The obsidian pillar ignited. It didn't burn with a normal, flickering flame. A brilliant, impossibly bright, unearthly light erupted from the wick, casting sharp, strange shadows across the vast vault. The moment the light flared, Ned's mind was violently pulled from his body. He didn't stagger. He stood perfectly still, but his consciousness was plunged backward through 4 centuries of time. The vision hit him with the force of a hurricane. He was no longer standing in a dark vault. He was standing on a high balcony, looking out over the magnificent, impossible city of Valyria in its absolute prime. Towers of fused stone scraped the heavens. Hundreds of dragons filled the sky, their roars a continuous, deafening symphony. The wealth, the power, the sheer, staggering hubris of the freehold was overwhelming. But the vision shifted, pulling him violently downward, deep into the fiery bowels of the 14 flames. He saw the blood mages. They were not the aristocratic dragon lords who ruled the sky. They were dark, twisted men and women, their bodies scarred by arcane rituals, standing in massive, subterranean caverns filled with rivers of molten magma. Ned felt their intent. They were greedy. The dragons were not enough. The subjugation of Essos was not enough. They sought absolute godlike supremacy. They were performing a ritual of immense, catastrophic scale, attempting to draw limitless, infinite power directly from the molten core of the world itself. It was the absolute extreme of the dark path. They were not balancing the energy of the world. They were attempting to enslave it, to drain the lifeblood of the earth to fuel their own immortality. Ned watched in horror as the ritual reached its climax. The blood mages channeled the dark, parasitic magic deep into the mantle. The world rebelled. The force, the natural balance of life and energy, violently rejected the intrusion. The backlash was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Ned felt the agony of the earth as the crust shattered. He watched the 14 flames detonate simultaneously, blowing mountains into the sky in a curtain of fire and ash. The magic consumed them. The blood mages burned to ash in a fraction of a heartbeat. The dragons fell from the sky, their wings burning. The greatest civilization in human history was eradicated in a single afternoon of absolute, unmitigated fury. Absolute power without balance brings only annihilation. The lesson he had taught his children in the Godswood was displayed before him in terrifying, absolute clarity. The vision shifted one final time. The fire was raging, consuming everything. But amidst the chaos, standing in the very valley where the oasis now lay, Ned saw a lone figure. It was a mage, clad in pure white robes, kneeling on the trembling earth. This mage was not drawing power. They were giving it. They were walking the path of light, pouring every ounce of their life essence, their soul, and their magic into the ground. Ned watched as the mage's physical body literally dissolved, turning to ash and blowing away in the superheated wind. But from their sacrifice, a massive, shimmering dome of pure, protective energy expanded outward, sealing the valley, shielding the temple from the catastrophic eruption that leveled the rest of the peninsula. The light mage had sacrificed their life to preserve the sanctuary, a final act of balance against the greed that had doomed their world. The blinding light of the glass candle flared one final time, and the vision abruptly vanished. Ned's consciousness slammed back into his physical body in the dark, silent vault. He opened his eyes. The glass candle had gone dark, reverting to a cold pillar of obsidian. A lesser man wielding such power would have collapsed, their mind shattering from the immense spiritual strain of the cataclysmic echo. Ned Stark simply let out a long, slow breath. Ben-Jen stepped up to the dais, looking at his brother with concern. "Ned, you grabbed the stone and it glowed like a fallen star. You stood there like a statue for 5 minutes. What did you see?" Ned looked at his brother, his gray eyes carrying the weight of 400 years of history. "I saw the doom, Ben-Jen," Ned said softly. "I saw that it was not a natural disaster. It was the price of greed. The Valyrians dug too deep into the dark. They sought infinite power, and it burned them to ash. This sanctuary, it was preserved by the sacrifice of a single balanced soul." He turned away from the candles, looking out at the mountains of wealth and weapons. The lesson was etched into his core. He walked down from the dais, addressing Willem and the guard. "We rest in the oasis tonight," Ned commanded, taking charge of the preparations. "Tomorrow morning the labor begins. We take the gold. We take the steel. We take the ingots, the weapons, the armor, the eggs, and the candles." Ned looked at the staggering horde. It would take a monumental effort to transport it all back to the coast. "We will carry as much as the Winter's Lance can safely bear without compromising her speed," Ned finished. "We will make as many trips back and forth through the ash as necessary. We are taking the treasures of the Dragon Lords back to the north. And when the true war comes, we will be ready. The Wolf Guard nodded in unison, their eyes shining with purpose. They had entered the ruins as guards. They would leave as the most heavily armed, deadliest fighting force in the history of Westeros. Chapter 85: The Horde of the Dragon Lords. The morning sun over the ruins of Valyria did not bring warmth. It brought a suffocating, bruising light that filtered through the perpetual haze of yellow sulfur and gray ash. But inside the magical boundary of the hidden oasis, the light was clean, fracturing through the silver leaves of the ancient, unburnt trees. Eddard Stark stood at the threshold of the sanctuary, where the soft, mossy earth abruptly ended and the jagged, melted landscape of the Doom began. He had drawn a line in the dirt with the tip of his boot. Behind him, the 50 men of the Wolf Guard stood in absolute, terrifying silence. They were no longer dressed in their dark cloaks. They had stripped down to their heavy leather trousers and linen undershirts, their faces tied with the vinegar-soaked cloths that had kept them alive during the initial crossing. Before them lay a mountain of wealth and power, meticulously dragged out from the Vault of the 14 and organized in the center of the oasis. There were rows of raw Valyrian steel ingots, dark and rippling, stacked like common iron pigs. There were racks of pristine weapons, long swords, heavy double-bladed axes, slender daggers, and brutal war hammers, all forged of the priceless magical metal. There were the 5 petrified dragon eggs, nestled in padded leather sacks. There were the 2 massive, silver-banded dragonbinder horns. There were heavy, iron-bound chests filled with ancient, crumbling tomes and scrolls preserved by the vault's magic, containing the lost lore of the Freehold. There were the 6 twisted pillars of obsidian glass candles. And finally, there were the heavy, rotting wooden chests overflowing with the gold coins of the ancient empire. We have exactly 2 leagues between the edge of this sanctuary and the glass pier where the Winter's Lance rests, Ned announced, his voice carrying the firm, unyielding authority of a commander outlining a siege. He pointed to the staggering pile of artifacts. This is not plunder. This is the arsenal of the North. Every ounce of that dark steel, every page of those books, is a weapon we will need when the true winter falls. But it is heavy, and the road is poison. /N. He didn't tell them about Long Night, it's just a figure of speech. Ned turned to face his men. He saw the sweat already beading on their brows, the sheer, daunting physical reality of the task ahead setting in. We will move like ants, Ned commanded. We load what we can carry. We march to the pier. We stow it in the hold. And we return here before the sun sets. We sleep in the clean air of the oasis. At dawn, we repeat the march. We do this until the ship reached its load-carrying capacity. Willem, the captain of the Wolf Guard, stepped forward. He did not complain about the heat, the toxic air, or the sheer weight of the gold. He simply evaluated the load. The ingots and the armor are the heaviest, Lord Stark, Willem noted. We should prioritize the steel. The gold can wait for the final trips. Agreed, Ned said. Secure the steel first. Bind the weapons together. Wrap the glass candles carefully. They are fragile. And Benjen. Ned looked at his brother, who was already securing a heavy canvas sack filled with 3 Valyrian steel battle axes across his broad shoulders. You and I will carry the eggs and the horns, Ned said. I do not want them leaving our sight. The labor began. It was a grueling, agonizing routine that tested the absolute limits of the physical conditioning Ned had instilled in them. The iron path drills, the endless sprints with heavy sandbags, the deep squats, the grueling physical holds, paid their dividends in the ashes of the Doom. The Wolf Guard shouldered burdens that would have broken normal men. They strapped heavy crates of Valyrian ingots to their backs. They carried stacks of dark swords. They moved out of the pristine, cool air of the oasis and stepped into the suffocating, blistering heat of the ruined city. The march to the sea was a silent procession of ghosts. The ground beneath their boots was treacherous, jagged obsidian, brittle pumice, and the ever-present threat of hidden magma tubes. The air burned their eyes and throats, the vinegar masks providing only a meager defense against the toxic, sulfurous winds. Ned and Benjen walked at the center of the column. Ned carried a heavy, reinforced sack containing 3 of the massive dragon eggs, the weight of them surprisingly dense, like solid stone. Benjen carried the remaining 2 eggs and the massive, twisted dragonbinder horns. They did not speak. To open their mouths was to invite the ash in. They navigated the broken, melted avenues of the dead city, relying on Ned's constant, sweeping connection to the earth to avoid the pockets of poisonous gas and the unstable ground. They reached the black glass pier where the Winter's Lance sat safely elevated above the corrosive, boiling waters of the harbor. The men moved with relentless efficiency, marching up the gangplank and stowing the priceless cargo deep in the lowest holds of the ship, packing it tightly into the plain, unadorned wooden crates they had brought from Winterfell specifically for this purpose. Once the load was secured, they turned around, drank sparingly from their water skins, and marched back into the yellow haze. They made 2 trips on the first day. By the time they returned to the oasis as the sky turned a bruised, fiery purple, the men were completely exhausted. They collapsed onto the soft, mossy grass, ripping their vinegar masks away, gasping for the sweet, pure air of the sanctuary. "Eat," Ned commanded, walking among them, appearing far less taxed than his men. The routine became a grinding, rhythmic blur. For 5 consecutive days, the Wolf Guard enacted their grueling march. They stripped the ancient vault of its magic. They carried the pitch-black Valyrian scale armor, light in the hands but incredibly cumbersome in bulk. They carried the ancient, crumbling tomes, wrapping them in thick layers of linen to protect them from the humid, corrosive air of the ruins. On the 6th day, they moved what gold they could carry. It took 4 trips to move just a fraction of the staggering wealth of the Dragonlords. All the treasures were dumped into plain wooden crates, disguising a king's ransom in the mundane packaging of simple trade goods. By the evening of the 6th day, the center of the oasis was quiet. They had taken the steel, the tomes, the candles, and the eggs, but mountains of gold still remained in the vault. The Winter's Lance, for all her superb craftsmanship, simply could not bear the immense weight of the entire hoard without sinking into the boiling sea. They had taken only a fraction, yet it was still enough to buy half the 7 kingdoms. The 50 men of the Wolf Guard lay scattered across the sanctuary, their bodies battered, their muscles aching with a profound, deep soreness. Their boots were scuffed white with ash, their leather trousers stained with sweat and sulfur. Yet, there was a profound sense of grim pride radiating from them. They had robbed the graveyard of the greatest empire in history, and they had survived. Ned stood near the edge of the crystal stream, washing his face in the cool water. He looked back at the unmelted, pristine black marble of the temple hidden in the trees, knowing the vast majority of its golden treasure would remain waiting in the dark. "We leave the sanctuary exactly as we found it," Ned ordered, his voice echoing softly in the quiet grove. "We have the steel and a portion of the gold. The rest remains for another day, or belongs to the ghosts." He turned to his men. "Rest tonight. Sleep deeply. At dawn we make the final march to the pier, and we set sail for home." The morning of their departure broke with a heavy, oppressive fog rolling in from the smoking sea, obscuring the melted towers of the city in a dense, white shroud. The pack marched to the glass pier for the final time. They carried their tents, their remaining rations, and their weapons. They did not look back at the ruins. They reached the harbor. The Winter's Lance sat upon the solid, fused black stone of the pier, exactly where Ned had placed her days ago to save her hull from the boiling, acidic sludge of the water. "Board the ship," Ned commanded. "Secure yourselves. Do not stand near the rails." The Wolf Guard, trusting their lord absolutely, hurried up the gangplank. They took their positions, holding tightly to the masts and the rigging, bracing for a violent, jarring impact. Benjen stood near the helm, watching his brother with wide, anxious eyes. Ned remained alone on the black glass pier. He walked to the very edge of the stone, facing the massive, dark ironwood hull of the Winter's Lance. "Lift." He simply grasped the space entirely surrounding it. The air around the massive vessel shimmered, a visible distortion like heat rising from a summer road. With a smooth, terrifyingly silent motion, the Winter's Lance rose from the stone. There was no groaning of timber. There was no splashing of water. The ship, laden with its priceless, heavy cargo, simply floated upward as if it weighed no more than a dry autumn leaf. On the deck, the Wolf Guard gasped. They felt no sudden lurch, no sickening drop in their stomachs. The deck beneath their boots remained perfectly level, perfectly stable. Ned raised his right hand slightly, his fingers relaxed. The massive ship glided forward, drifting smoothly over the edge of the pier and out over the churning, boiling black water of the harbor. Ned lowered his hand. The Winter's Lance descended gently, kissing the surface of the water with a soft, hissing splash. The heavy lead keel bit into the sea, the ship settling deeply into the water due to her massive burden, but finding her perfect, natural balance instantly. Ned walked to the edge of the pier and leapt lightly across the small gap, landing softly on the deck of his ship. He turned to the helm, looking at the stunned faces of his brother and his captain. "Muster the oars," Ned commanded smoothly, as if he hadn't just defied the fundamental laws of reality. "Get us out of this cursed harbor and into the mist. Once we are clear of the reefs, raise the sails." Willem swallowed hard, shaking his head in sheer, unadulterated awe. "Oars out," he roared to the men. "Pull us into the fog. Move." The long ash oars deployed, dipping into the hissing water. The Winter's Lance pulled away from the ruins of Valyria, slipping silently back into the dense, yellow shroud of the smoking sea. The ghost of the lion. The navigation outward was just as treacherous as the journey inward, but the fear was gone. The pack had faced the heart of the doom and emerged victorious. Ned stood at the prow, his senses extended far ahead of the ship, expertly weaving the heavy vessel through the maze of submerged dragonglass reefs and boiling geysers. On their way to the return voyage, the dense white steam parted slightly, revealing a familiar, haunting silhouette drifting aimlessly in the dead currents. The Laughing Lion. The massive, scorched Lannister galleon still floated exactly where they had left it, its snapped masts and tattered crimson sails looking utterly forlorn in the mist. "The Lannister ship," Benjen murmured, stepping up beside Ned at the rail. Ned looked at the ruined vessel. On their way into Valyria, he had forbidden any deviation from their path, refusing to risk the mission for a distraction. But now, their holds carried what they needed, their primary objective complete. "Bring us alongside her," Ned ordered the helmsman. "Gently. Do not shatter her hull." The Winter's Lance drifted closer, the sailors using long poles to push away from the scorched flanks of the Lannister ship, preventing a harsh collision. They threw grappling lines, securing the two vessels together in the swirling fog. Ned turned to Benjen. "Take Willem and 4 of your best men. Tie thick cloths soaked in the vinegar over your faces. Do not breathe the air in her lower decks deeply." Benjen frowned. "What am I looking for?" "A sword," Ned said. "A great sword. It will likely be in the captain's cabin, or clutched in the hands of whoever died last. Bring it to me." Benjen nodded, recognizing the importance of the command. He signaled to Willem, and the small team quickly prepared themselves, tying the acrid, biting cloths over their noses and mouths. They swung over the rails, dropping onto the scorched, creaking deck of the Laughing Lion. Ned watched them disappear into the gloom of the aft cabins. He reached out with his senses, keeping a careful, protective watch over their life signatures. The wait felt interminable. The minutes ticked by, accompanied only by the eerie creaking of the two ships grinding against each other in the swells. Finally, a heavy boot kicked open the splintered door of the captain's quarters. Benjen stepped out into the misty light, coughing slightly through his vinegar mask. He was carrying something long and heavy, wrapped in a rotting, salt-stained crimson cloak. Willem and the guards followed, looking pale and thoroughly unsettled by whatever horrors they had witnessed in the dark. They scrambled back over the rails onto the clean, solid deck of the Winter's Lance. Benjen pulled the vinegar cloth down from his face, taking a deep gulp of the relatively cleaner sea air. He walked over to Ned, holding the bundle out. "The lower decks are a charnel house, Ned," Benjen reported, his voice tight with disgust. "The men down there didn't burn. They withered away to nothing. When we forced open the barricaded door of the captain's cabin, I found a figure slumped over the desk. I assume it was Geryon Lannister. He was nothing but dry, hollow bones draped in fine, rotting velvet. He was clutching this." Benjen shivered slightly, staring at the bundle in his hands. "When I reached out to pry it from his grip," Benjen continued softly, "my glove merely brushed his knuckles, and the bones simply crumbled into pale dust. It was as if the doom had baked the very marrow from him." Benjen pulled back the rotting crimson fabric. The collective breath of the nearby guards caught in their throats. It was a magnificent weapon, a massive greatsword nearly as long as ice. The blade was forged of pale, smoky Valyrian steel, but it was the hilt that commanded attention. The crossguard was fashioned of solid, gleaming gold, shaped into the roaring heads of twin lions. The pommel was a massive, flawless ruby, catching the dull light of the fog and reflecting it like a trapped fire. Bright Roar, the lost ancestral sword of House Lannister, a blade that had been missing for over a century, a source of immense shame and relentless obsession for Tywin Lannister. Ned looked at the magnificent golden-hilted sword. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. The political and martial weight of the prize was staggering. To possess the ancestral blade of his greatest rival was not merely a victory. It was an absolute masterstroke. It was a piece of leverage so heavy it could crack Casterly Rock itself. "A fine prize," Ned said softly, reaching out to trace the golden lions of the crossguard. The lion sent a cub to find his claws, and the wolf took them both. He looked at Benjen, his smile widening. "Wrap it securely. Stow it with rest of the horde." "Are you going to use it?" Benjen asked, securing the rotting cloak back around the blade. "I have ice," Ned said simply. "But a sword like this, it is not meant for fighting. It is meant for bargaining. Or breaking pride." He turned back to the helm. "Cast off the lines," Ned ordered loudly. "Leave the ghost to the sea. We set course for the open water." Breaking free of the smoking sea was like waking from a long, suffocating nightmare. When the winter's lance finally pierced the outer perimeter of the fog bank, bursting out into the clean, crisp blue of the summer sea, the entire crew let out a spontaneous, unified cheer. They ripped the remaining vinegar masks from their faces and breathed in the salty, fresh wind with desperate gratitude. They had survived the doom, but their journey was far from over, and the cargo they carried demanded absolute, fierce secrecy. If word reached the Free Cities or the Iron Throne that Eddard Stark was sailing a ship filled with thousands of pounds of Valyrian steel, dragon eggs, and ancient gold, they would be hunted. Every pirate from the Stepstones to the Basilisk Isles, every ambitious magister, and perhaps even King Robert himself, would seek to claim the hoard. "We do not sail the trade routes," Ned commanded the captain, a seasoned navigator from White Harbor. Ned pulled the small wooden box from his tunic, revealing the floating, magnetized iron needle. Ned, placing it carefully on the binnacle, said, "We do not hug the coast. We do not sail past Volantis, or Lys, or Dorne. We turn our prow directly into the deep ocean. We sail north by northwest, cutting a straight line through the open water, far beyond the sight of any merchant cog or war galley." Willem looked at it and nodded. He has experience using it. The voyage was long, monotonous, and entirely unseen. For weeks, they saw nothing but endless blue water and open sky. They avoided the treacherous, pirate-infested waters of the Stepstones entirely, swinging in a massive, wide arc far to the east before finally cutting back toward the western coast of Westeros. The sheer speed of the Winter's Lance, aided by its ironwood hull and lateen sails, made the journey manageable, but the isolation pressed heavily on the men. Yet the Wolfguard remained disciplined. They knew they were guarding the future of their kingdom. They spent their days maintaining their physical conditioning on the deck, sparring with wooden swords, and resting in the crisp sea air. Finally, after nearly a moon and a half of relentless sailing, the familiar, jagged, unforgiving coastline of the north broke the horizon. The sky over Sea Dragon Point was a familiar, comforting canopy of thick, gray clouds, threatening snow. The air was biting and fresh, smelling intensely of pine needles and cold stone. To the men returning from the ashes of Valyria, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. The Winter's Lance sailed smoothly into the deep-water harbor, passing beneath the imposing, dark basalt watchtowers of Sea Dragon Hold. The harbor was significantly quieter than it had been during the massive gathering for Benjen's wedding months ago. The grand fleets of the south had long since departed, leaving only a small detachment of northern Carracks patrolling the bay. As the ship docked at the heavy timber piers, a small, heavily armed welcoming party was waiting. Standing at the front of the pier was Lady Meage Mormont. The formidable she-bear wore her usual attire of practical boiled leather and a heavy fur cloak, a mace resting comfortably on her hip. Flanking her were two of her daughters, fierce young women of Bear Island who looked ready to brawl at a moment's notice. The gangplank lowered. Ned and Benjen walked down, the cold wind whipping their cloaks. "Lord Stark, Benjen." Meage greeted them, her voice a rough, welcoming gravel. She offered a brief, respectful bow, not bothering with flowery southern courtesies. "The watchtowers reported your sails an hour ago. We had begun to wonder if the sea had swallowed you." "The sea tried, Lady Meage," Ned replied, grasping her forearm firmly. "But the north is stubborn." Benjen looked around the docks, his eyes searching the faces of the guards and the castle servants. A slight frown creased his brow. "Where is Daisy?" Benjen asked, his voice laced with sudden, quiet concern. He had expected his new wife to be the first one waiting on the pier. Meej offered a sharp, completely unbothered grin. She is resting, Lord Benjen. She spent the morning throwing axes in the yard and complained of a sudden, fierce fatigue. The maester warned he not to, but you know how stubborn she is, so we let her sleep. Benjen shook his head hearing that. No one can tell his she-bear what she should do. Meej offered a single, highly confirming nod. Benjen exhaled a long, shaky breath, a brilliant, unrestrained smile breaking across his face. I see. I will go to her immediately. You will go nowhere yet, brother? Ned interrupted smoothly, his voice dropping into the absolute, commanding tone of the Warden of the North. Benjen stopped, his excitement curbed instantly by the gravity in Ned's voice. Ned turned his full attention to Meej Mormont. He stepped closer to her, ensuring their conversation would not carry to the sailors or the dockworkers. Lady Meej, Ned said, his voice a low, intense rumble. The cargo in the hold of this ship is the most valuable, and the most dangerous collection of artifacts currently existing in the known world. The fate of the North depends upon its absolute security. Meej's demeanor shifted instantly. The easy, teasing aunt vanished, replaced by the hardened commander of Bear Island. She stood straighter, her hand resting firmly on her mace. I need our most trusted men, Ned commanded. Men who would cut out their own tongues before whispering a word of what they see. I want the wooden crates in the lowest hold unloaded immediately. They are heavy. They are to be transported directly, without any stops or detours, to the deepest, most secure treasury vault beneath the bedrock of Sea Dragon Hold. Ned locked his gray eyes onto Meej. You will personally supervise every single step of this transfer, Meej. You will not let a single crate out of your sight until that vault door is locked, barred, and guarded by your own kin. Do you understand the severity of this command? Meej Mormont did not blink. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the order pressing down on her, and she accepted it without hesitation. It will be done exactly as you command, Lord Stark. Meej swore, her voice devoid of any humor. The vault will be sealed tighter than a tomb. No one speaks of this. Good, Ned said, stepping back, the intense pressure radiating from him subsiding slightly. He turned to the 50 men of the Wolf Guard, who were standing in silent, exhausted formation at the base of the gangplank. They looked haggard, their faces lined with the strain of a journey that defied comprehension. You have accomplished the impossible, Ned told his men, his voice filled with profound, genuine pride. You walked into hell and you brought back the fire. The North owes you a debt it can never fully repay. He looked at Willem. Your men are relieved of all duties, Captain. For a week, I want you to eat the kitchens bare. I want you to sleep in warm beds. I want you to visit the hot baths until your skin prunes. You are completely off duty. Go rest. The Wolf Guard did not cheer, but a collective, deep sigh of immense relief swept through their ranks. They bowed deeply to their lord and began the slow, weary march up the winding road toward the comforts of the fortress. Ned watched them go. He felt the exhaustion finally catching up to his own bones. Even with the internal reserves he carried, the constant mental vigilance and the heavy burden of command had taken a toll. He turned to Benjen. Come, brother, Ned said, offering a tired smile. Let us go up to your castle. I believe you have a sleeping wife to wake, and I am in desperate need of a hot meal, a strong cup of our whiskey, and a bed that doesn't sway. Benjen grinned, clapping Ned on the shoulder. Lead the way, Lord Stark.